Let's get this show started. Our first speaker, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Verlinden. He is a biochemist active in the African pharmaceutical sector since 2010, supporting dozens of pharmaceutical companies in the manufacture and the release testing of pharmaceutical dosage forms. Jeff is passionate about the formalization and harmonization of global medical cannabis manufacture and testing standards. Jeff regularly engages with licensed cultivators, GMP facilities, compliant testing laboratories, regulatory authorities, and buyers and sellers internationally. Please welcome Jeff Verlinden.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me in Mexico. It's a great pleasure here to be speaking about my experience in the pharmaceutical manufacturing space. While the slideshow is coming up, I'd like to just thank JuicyFields for the opportunity to share my experience. I come from a background focused a lot on aseptic, sterile products, non-sterile products, but increasingly over the last 2-3 years, we've been trying to understand how medical cannabis will work into the space as well as the different standards. Right, great. So today what I'd like to do is I'm going to give you an overview essentially of a few things. What medical products are out there, as well as what general cannabis products are out there. Can I have the screen displayed here as well in the front? We're going to talk about the processing of medical flower, the processing workflows in terms of extraction, what to consider. We're going to talk ultimately about the sliding scale of GMP, as well as our example of product release. And from there, we're going to go into testing, and then what does success ultimately look for? Right, let's jump ahead. So there's different types of products out there in the space. We have what we'd call our infused and our edible products on the far left of your screen. This is quite an important category because there may be regulations that result from novel foods to consider here as well. Increasingly, if you're going to have your beverage companies or food companies participate in the space, we need to have a quality of standard for testing and release that's going to allow for these products to proliferate. We also need a regulatory framework that's going to allow us to drive that. We also have the more traditional product, which is like you see your flour products. In the US, there's a dispensary model that you'll be familiar with. Just below that, in the jars underneath that, you'll see a typical bedrocan product. Now, a bedrocan product is a medicinal product that's going to be going through more extensive testing, more extensive cultivation, to ultimately allow you to release a product to a vulnerable patient or for a specific indication. And then there's different types of formats like pre-rolls, and this more or less goes back into what I'd consider the adult use market. In addition, you might be familiar with something like a GW pharmaceutical product. This is something that has a marketing authorization, has an FDA approval. This is something where there's a medical dossier for the product, its manufacturing. I anticipate most regulatory environments around the world that are new to medical cannabis will be looking for something that has clinical evidence, like a GW pharmaceutical Epidiolex. However, we've seen around the world the special access schemes really giving a voice to unregistered flower forms and magistral formulations, which we'll talk about. There's also cosmetic and wellness products. Depending on your jurisdiction, where you are, this might fall outside of medicine. It may be included in medicine. So it's important to know that in South Africa, for instance, cosmetics and wellness products might fall outside of medical claims. And then we have the adult use market, which has your terpenes, your vape pens, your crumble, your shatter, a lot of the recreational type products. And I would expect in the far corner, you'll see a metered dose, almost like an asthma inhaler. That will increasingly become more of a medical type release product. So in the next slide, I think this is helpful because when you deal with cannabis, there really are so many different regulations, there are so many different products, and there's so many different end use and application. So I've tried to define for you how I see the product world. In the middle, we have a product, we have a medical product, we have a wellness type product, and we have an adult use market product. So let's start with the medical product. Medical usually split into a registered medicine or an unregistered medicine. Now, when you're talking about a registered medicine, like I mentioned, Epidiolex, you really need to look at a product now that has a marketing authorization by the regulator in your country. It has clinical trials that support its indication for use. It has a dossier in terms of its manufacturing, how it gets tested. The testing is really important for safety and compliance, and it will be usually manufactured under a GACP, Good Agricultural and Collection Practices, and then packed or finished off in a GMP facility. So that's how I see a registered product. You do need to understand that this is a very small percentage of products in the world. These are the ones that have gotten heavy investment at an early stage, and then we come to an unregistered medicine. The unregistered medicine on the other side is very often what you would see. I would say this is where special access schemes in Australia, potentially some magistral formulations can loosely be defined here. Yeah, there's a big push from a regulator where you've got to work with the medical regulator. This is usually how you really enable access, because a registered medicine is quite expensive, and it's not often what we first think of when we talk about medical cannabis. So an unregistered medication, yeah, we've got to work with the regulator. How do they want to allow for dispensing of these products? How do they want to allow for access? You know, Australia's done a good job of automating access. South Africa less so. Germany has done a good job on access. So you've got to look at these markets, because if you're going to produce a compliant flower, it will typically go into an unregistered medicine for now, unless you've supported it with clinical evidence to migrate it into a registered medicine. So in that space, you've got to deal heavily with the regulator. You also need to conform to the appropriate GACP and GMP standards for that region. There may be a monograph. So for those in the room that are familiar with the Dutch and German markets, they have a clear monograph going forward. This is increasingly important. If you want to define a product, you've got to define its quality for medical use, and therefore we need to see regulatory areas define their monograph for an extract, for a flower format, and then the associated testing. To a wellness product. So if we move down, I've listed CBD wellness, but if we're talking other minor cannabinoids, if we're talking broad spectrum products, usually also with the wellness products, we have two markets split here: regulated, unregulated. Now I'll say this about the unregulated market. There's a lot of product innovation here. You're going to see this constantly driving the state of the art for the type of product in the market. However, there is uncertainty, because when you're scaling a business, when you're increasing your customer base, you need to make sure that you're compliant, and if you're in an unregulated market, at any point the regulator can shift. It can say, we are now requiring the following standards. We now require you to test for the following. We require labeling specification that you cannot exceed. So that's the risk you run. If it's well regulated, it will typically have something where there could be a potential product call-up. What that means is, if you have products on the shelf and you don't need a prescription for it, it needs to just conform to its label claims. And that's also where the label claims and novel foods regulation becomes important. So in the UK, at the end of March, there was a push for a lot of dossiers to be submitted for novel foods. And that makes it increasingly hard. It puts it similar to a registered medicine, because you have to do as much work, and anyone who's done a dossier for a product knows that can be quite an expensive exercise. It's good because it assures quality. It's potentially commercially good because it also limits the scope of operators in the market. So it's not just everyone from their house is producing a product that's being sold at a retailer. Those are retail products that have to go through some kind of quality assurance so they can be provided as a not necessarily scheduled, and that's where I list scheduling as a potential concern. Additionally, for me, adult use is a big question point. I would say this: the adult use market is the biggest market, and I expect that to continue to trend. Like, the medical market is a very specific, very developed, very complex market, but adult use is heavily dependent on policy. And in areas where policy is allowed, Canada, certain states in the US, this is where the most revenue is driven from. So we do see a natural progression for decriminalization, medical use, or maybe not decriminalization, just medical use first, and eventually a migration to adult use. Here, your biggest concern is the illicit market and testing. You know, there is much to be said about the need for kind of quality standards in adult use, but it will always fall lower than compared to your medicine or wellness-based product that's linked. Good. So I want to jump ahead to processing of medical flower, because that's a big topic. There's some good reference points here. There's Europam working groups, WHO recommendations on GACP. I want to refer to Redrolex, the EU Volume 4, specifically on the manufacture of herbal medicinal products. There are going to be speakers today that talk about cultivation, but for me, the main thing for you to remember is you're going to probably need to combine good agricultural and collection practices with good manufacturing practices. And where that line spreads and switches over is up for debate in different jurisdictions. But just know that what you really want to focus on is, where's my final product going to go? If I'm providing a bulk API to a client that's going to then do further packing, right? I need to worry about one thing when I talk about GACP. Is what I'm cultivating, the final product, going to meet the testing requirements of release? Because there's a lot of interpretation to be had under GACP, but if you, for instance, need to meet a certain micro level, and your micro levels are too high, you're never going to pass off that product as a compliant biomass. If you've got aflatoxins present or you've got pesticides present, you will struggle to sell that on to a GMP facility or partner in a different jurisdiction or within your country. So it's really important. It's easy to set up tunnels, to do netting, to go for any kind of GACP as an agricultural product, but you really have to focus on my release. And that's my biggest advice is, if you're looking to put it into a medical format like a Bedrocan dispensed container with 5 grams of flour, you've got to be very cognizant of that. All right, processing. I'm not going to do too much here in terms of, it's a very dense slide. I'm happy to discuss this in further detail, but we saw in the beginning, there's a lot of products that are not just flour. And I would expect, based on my experience within the pharmaceutical world, that most pharmaceutical companies are looking for some form of proprietary formulation or protection on a product, which means they want to eventually go to something of an isolate route and a recombination of different profiles. So you might be driving towards certain isolates, CBD, THC, CBG, and you might be looking to isolate terpenes, reformulate all of this, and put it back into a compliant product that has got a specific quantity on that product, which means this makes it a lot easier for clinical trials and approvals. Now, that is a long process. It's a bit of a backward process because you've got a great botanical, and now you're deriving and derivatizing it to only put it back into a very comprehensive product. But for control purposes and proprietary points, pharmaceutical companies tend to go this way. I'm just going to discuss briefly in terms of processing, because this is what I came to talk on. You've got to look at pre-processing, extraction, post-processing, and product finish. Those are your 4 main points. Pre-processing, it's very, whenever you grow great flour, it's a shame to mill it and produce it for extraction. Just know that we want to have as much control in manufacturing. So we want a homogeneous product. We want something that's got the same size particle, so that when we run an extraction for a certain time, we always get the same result, considering we've got a lot of variability in biomass to contend with. So it's very tough, and I'm sure there'll be many speakers talking about getting biomass compliant, get it to the same percentages every cultivar, but in extraction, we're allowed to manipulate the product to some extent. So that manipulation is best facilitated. Do you need to carboxylate the product ahead of the time? For supercritical CO2, you would need to decarboxylate ahead of time. With an ethanol extraction, you can do it later on in the process. Mechanical extraction, there are different methods. They tend to be more boutique. So I see mechanical extraction more in like a rosin press, a very boutique type of product. In terms of your main extraction solvents, supercritical is interesting because of the terpene profile you can pull. Ethanol is very interesting from the bulk biomass you can produce through it. You might combine a bit of supercritical and ethanol. Ethanol is really going towards a cannabinoid-rich distillate. It's going to degrade terpenes. Propane, butane, hydrocarbons is challenging from a regulatory perspective. So whenever we talk about scale and a regulator, and if we're producing a medical product, because of the carcinogenic effects of hydrocarbons, you might not end up with something like a butane, propane being preferred. They might push for an ethanol or supercritical. And there's other forms like a centrifugal partitioning chromatography, but I won't waste your time on some of the more novel applications. You can always ask me afterwards. Post-processing, all you're doing here is essentially taking a crude and developing that crude further. So for supercritical, you'll winterize, remove waxes. The waxes could be used for cosmetic products. You would then clean up that product. Ethanol, you do some light filtration, ideally extract cold, negative 40 degrees Celsius or more, and you would ultimately look to just enrich. So we have things like distillation, rolling film distillation, work film, SPD. This is all about enrichment of the product, and I'll show you the next slide which shows you that. And then we have things like potential color remediation chromatography. We might have, if we're looking to do certain forms of remediation. In the wellness industry, you need to remediate out THC. So you might need to degrade or remove THC from a product to make it compliant in extraction. And then there's different ways to go about it. There's also the drive to isolates at the end of the workflow in order to produce an isolate product. And then the last thing that matters is what is your filling, your white labeling considerations, how you're going to pack, how you're going to formulate. Those are the big things you need to think about. So in a nutshell, in my next slide, this is just an overview of percentages at the bottom. So you can look at, I'm going to use THC concentration or CBD. THC is more appropriate, especially on the biomass concentrations there. Typically up to 25%. Your initial extraction would drive you up to 60%. Then you'd go up into enrichment. The point that's quite interesting there is the recombined derivatives. That's very common in the pharmaceutical world, where you extract different things, like you might do a terpene extraction of supercritical, run most of your biomass through an ethanol workstream for isolate or for distillate, and then look to combine those towards the end once you've enriched. Or you might go to a final pure isolate as a final product. Right, I quickly want to just discuss the different points on GMP. Very common in the North American market is the dietary versus the pharmaceutical standards. There is no FDA-approved cannabis-specific chapter, which makes it hard. Most cultivators, most extractors in the US do a dietary supplement finish, which is a CFR 111. Understand that that's not pharmaceutical. 99% of the operators in the US are dietary supplement grade GMP. They are not a pharmaceutical GMP standard. That is a 210, 211. And you can check this quite easily by verifying it on their certificates. Now, this I see a lot in the market is we're trying to sell commercial product that is pharmaceutical, but what happens is it's been packed under a packing company that's 210, 211 compliant, but it's been sourced from a 111 dietary supplement standard API. This is a very tricky point and it needs to be paid attention to, because if you're really trying to protect yourself from a finished product form, you need to make sure your extraction has been in a fully pharmaceutical 210, 211 facility, which is typically your EU GMP type of facility. Just a bit of context to it. The one thing I'd say as well is, in terms of the grade of an isolate, be cautious of this. Outdoor grown hemp, as is common in the US, derived to isolate, will never compete with highly controlled conditions for the production of that same isolate. There's a price differential here. You must know that 500 kilogram or $500 isolate, US dollar isolate, is outdoor sourced hemp derived. It is not GACP or highly compliant to the traditional sense. So I'll let the cultivators talk about this, but you cannot compete. We see in South Africa, as an example, a highly regulated cultivation environment, but you have to compete with the same isolate for a wellness good. That just is not feasible. So it's something to look out for in terms of the regulatory split. Always verify that in terms of your product. This is just an example of how products are sold in Europe. It's a little small, the font, but it's an example from the Office of Medical Cannabis on Bedrocan's products. The thing I just want to highlight here in closing is the thing you need to know, always know where your finished product is going. If you need to conform to this certificate of analysis, if this is your release standard, you must know that in this instance there's irradiation required for the product. You know, when was it harvested? When was it packed? Is there a monograph? So this conforms to the Dutch monograph, which means what is its appearance, what is its fineness, what is its microbiological purity. So here they're specifically referring to an EU chapter 5145 4. And there's a limitation on the colony-forming units for that microorganism. If it's aflatoxins, you need to prove absence, presence, or minimum limits. This is really important to know in terms of your final release. This will definitely be more for a medical product, but if you are, and I believe Mexico is very much focused on medical standards, this is what you need to know as an exit consideration for your final cultivation. And just to close off on the next part, so absence of heavy metals or limits on heavy metals, the moisture content, and then obviously that needs to be approved and signed off. You can see the certificate was signed off on the 11th of June, 2021. So that's still the standard within the Office of Medical Cannabis in the Netherlands. And that's an example. For me, the biggest challenge I see internationally is a harmonization or a lack of harmonization on monographs and standards. There needs to almost be a mutual recognized agreement for what a medical form looks like within Europe, within all PICS affiliated countries. Like, what is the standard that we all agree is acceptable? I don't think necessarily the Bedrocan standard will be appropriate for some products, but we need to harmonize and agree as an industry on what it should be. I'll just use a second last slide here. I've taken some time, this is from my own work, so don't take it as a complete reference, but I can't really find it elsewhere. But this is just an example of USP, so US pharmacopoeia standards compared to EU standards in alignment to the type of testing. So you might need several instruments to perform these tests. Things that are interesting, besides obviously potency, terpene profiling, heavy metals, pesticides, I find what's interesting most is the debate around microorganisms and the acceptable limits, if any, where it should be used. The extractables on packaging is often never discussed. Very often in pharmaceutical, we need to know what type of extractables we'll see from the packaging itself. The other thing that's super important is stability studies, and I'm referring to stability of the final product, not of the genetics. So what happens if you want to give a shelf life claim to a product, you need to know, is it stable 6 months, a year, 2 years? Because you need to put an expiry on that product. The thing I will say is, what is challenging, we all know the benefits of terpenes when it comes to the entourage effect, but terpenes are not very stable for long periods, which does make it a little difficult to map a trend on stability on that point. Additionally, things like if you've done an extraction, residual solvents. So to just close, and I hope I haven't run over on time, if you want to be on the top and not the bottom in that wrestling photo, you need to know, you need as much information as possible. You need to know, start with your product release, always start at the end. What does a compliant, tested product look like? If you do not know that, keep digging, keep asking, because you need to clarify that. Stay focused, do not overstretch. I see many teams that stretch into they want to do adult, they want to do medical, they want to do wellness. You're going to struggle. You need to pick your niche and focus on it. Are you fully compliant medical? Are you a wellness, fast-moving consumer good? Or are you an adult use if you're provided your country allows for that? Understand your manufacturing constraints. What does quality look like? How's it packed, extracted, formulated, and where's the compliance? The one thing I will say in the international market is start trending for your quality. You've got to start measuring your batch-to-batch variation. You can't register a product in a jurisdiction like Germany, and then next time you provide a batch that's different. You've got to be able to get your consistency between registered products. There's going to be very low tolerance going forward for variability between batches, so this is something to focus on. Make sure all your raw material sourcing is licensed, compliant throughout the thing. Investigate constantly. The one thing I will say that's different for me, the most different, is accept risk. This is an industry that is going to have massive risk. It was one of the toughest things for me to kind of deal with, is the lack of regulation, confirmations. There's a lot of good information, but you've got to be willing to take risk. Else you may as well get out of the room right now, to be honest. There is an inherent risk with this type of product and potential reward. And I would say lastly, question every assumption. Question everything you know about this industry and don't assume you know. This industry changes too quickly for there to be a set assumption in the marketplace. And lastly, if you do enjoy this content or you want more of it, I do keep some of this in the public domain. So feel free to, I keep it up on YouTube. I've done several discussions. I've interviewed more the South African market and some of their stakeholders. But if you do find it useful, reach out to me on LinkedIn, or feel free to just go and subscribe and watch on YouTube. Thank you again to JuicyFields, Michael and the team. I really appreciate the time, and I look forward to the next speaker, Thomas, coming on.